Amen. All right, so I'm calling this week's What in the World Worldview Minute, and I use the word minute loosely, right? This week in Christian Woke. So every now and then, I just kind of want to make sure that we're aware that a lot of this goofiness, this other worldview, this other religion that is shooting its way through our culture is also making its way into the church. It's making its way into churches that you might expect. If I asked you, well, who might you think? What denominations? What kind of churches do you think are just perfectly comfortable with the woke culture? You would list off a few of those, and you would be absolutely right. But then it happens in places that we wouldn't have expected a couple of years ago, and that's really where we're going to kind of land this evening to talk about an issue that just I keep watching and seeing, and I keep wrestling with myself why and how these kinds of things happen. But first, I want us to start with a hymn. All right, so you don't have to sing along because the words are new to you. You may have heard the tune though before.
God of many genders, our world reflects you. Sunrise and sunset uniting our hues, woven into a city with jewels of all shades, houses of ruby and walls wrought with jade. God of many names, we invite you to show us the new names that reflect our true souls.
All right. I had another video option I was going to show that was a prayer that was just over 2 minutes long, and I couldn't do it. You can't even show the first 30, 45 seconds of it, and it's just, interminable. Hey now. I think we've created a monster here, I think is what we've done. So, through the stuff that I read and pay attention to through the week, I sort of collect these items. I hang on to them, and then sometime on Monday or Tuesday, I start kind of going through some of them, and I think, well, what's going to be good? What do I want to talk about? What sort of sticks out? By the way, you should see the looks on most of your faces when I show some of these things. I saw a lot of tonsils. I saw a lot of confused looks. Yeah, deer in the headlight kind of stuff. No, I'm not. So it is so bad. It is bad, and then it is so bad. And then, so I'm going through these things, and I'm reading them back to back. I'm watching them back to back, and sometimes things just jump out. There are these common themes, and the common theme in what I was paying attention to this week was God is all about me. 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 And just even the 1.5 verses that we listened to here in 57 seconds of video was this God who is all about me, this God who is all about me, this God who is all about me. And you might have recognized the tune of that hymn. The name of the hymn is God of Our Fathers. So Heather and I were looking this up. Heather found all the verses. She actually found the author, Daniel C. Roberts. He wrote this hymn, The God of Our Fathers, in 1876 to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So that's what they sang. Do you want to hear what they sang one more time? Okay, thank you. Here's what, just so that we can sort of purge our brains of God of many genders, here's what God of Our Fathers sounds like. God of our fathers, whose almighty hand leads forth in beauty all the starry band of shining worlds and splendor through the skies, our grateful songs before thy throne arise. Thy love divine hath led us in the past. In this free land by thee our lot is cast. Be thou our ruler, guardian, guide, and stay. Thy word, our law, thy paths, our chosen way. From war's alarms, from deadly pestilence, be thy strong arm our ever sure defense. Thy true religion in our hearts increase. Thy bounteous goodness nourish us in peace. Refresh thy people in their toilsome way. Lead us from night to never-ending day. Fill all our lives with love and grace divine. In glory, laud, and praise be ever thine. Sounds so much better. And it's about God. And it's lead us in your ways. Lead us from night into day. I mean, just this dramatic difference, right? There's another reaction we should have when we see some of these things, and this is a video of a Zoom church service. There's another thing that should be going through our hearts and minds, and that is these poor, broken people are looking for something, and they're trying to find it, and they're finding it in all these wrong places that are just going to leave them dry and broken and dead. Many of them probably looking for father figures, and this is where they've landed. People like this just continue to need prayer and compassion and witness, right? So I told you there would be some churches that you would think, well, okay, I kind of expect that from, a denomination or a church like that. I want you to go into something else as well. So I've held off on this dude for a while now, but there's a gathering of things that has just made me thought, I want to actually start to talk about this. So there's a crazy phenomenon that's happened over the last 2 years, and we see it most clearly in several Christian leaders, evangelical Christian leaders out there. Maybe the one name that everybody knows the best is the guy who created VeggieTales, Phil Vischer. He's had a podcast for several years with 2 other co-hosts that years ago I used to listen to on a religious basis. It was a very good podcast. Phil Vischer is actually a very thoughtful and intelligent man. Phil Vischer and the other members, co-hosts of his podcast, have changed some of their views over the last 2 years. So when this bill came out in Florida about not allowing LGBTQ sexual grooming curriculum into elementary schools was passed, what is labeled the Don't Say Gay bill. There's nothing in the bill that actually says that. That's just the label that's given to it. Soon after, Phil Vischer comes out and he likens the bill to segregation. So he says, passing that bill is really not all that much different than Christians when they segregated schools between blacks and whites. So he says this, and there's this whole long podcast with him and his friends discussing it. This is an article that takes some excerpts from it. LifeSite News, one of the creators of one of the most popular Christian children's entertainment properties, suggested this week that a new Florida law banning sexual proselytizing in K-3 public education was animated by a similar impulse to that which sustained racial segregation generations ago. 2 paragraphs later, as highlighted by woke preacher clips, which, by the way, is one of the hottest Twitter feeds that's out there. If you're on Twitter, you're going to want to follow woke preacher clips if you want to be aggravated on a regular basis. A Twitter account dedicated to highlighting examples of theology at the intersection of woke and cringe, which, by the way, is where I found the hymn. So, Vischer said during the podcast that the only thing that would compare to the controversy over the exposure of children to LGBTQ content, quote, goes back to race, when you had people honestly arguing in some parts of the South that my religion teaches the races must be kept separate, and now the government is wanting to put the races together. This is a huge impasse. Okay, here's the translation of that. So Christian people in the South once believed that white kids, or some Christians in the South, once believed that white kids should not be exposed to black kids, so they wanted to segregate the schools. What he says is that's the same as parents who want to segregate their children from LGBTQ affirming curriculum. So he's likening it to the evil of segregation. So the clear implication is that the only moral thing to do is to allow this sexually grooming curriculum into K through 3 education. He wrote Veggie Tales. He was on the Christian speaking circuit for a long time. A few years ago, I would have suggested several of his lectures, the kinds of things that he talked about, and now he's saying this kind of stuff, that you Christians are like racial segregationists if you don't want this kind of curriculum inside of your school. So here's a screenshot of that podcast. Most of you probably don't know the two on the bottom. The guy on the bottom right, his name is Skye Jethani. He's been a Christian speaker and author. He was actually one of the editors at Christianity Today for years and years and years. Then he left and started writing books. I've got one of his books that he wrote a long time ago. It's a wonderful book. But Skye Jethani has gone just as crazy as Phil Vischer. So now get this. Now, I use this on purpose because I see this kind of thing being said and written a lot, and I want to try to get a handle on this. So Skye Jethani in the bottom right, what he says during this podcast, I fear what's going to happen here is similar to what happened with racial segregation. A bunch of Christians decided we're not on board with this and then create back when it was segregation academies. Now it's going to be, I don't know, traditional marriage academies or something. So he's saying the worst thing about this is I'm afraid that Christians are going to become segregationists again, and they're going to pull their kids out of public schools and put them into private schools, and segregationist traditional churches. So who is Skye Jethani blaming this problem on? He's blaming it on Christians. Who is Phil Vischer blaming in this entire process? Christians who say this is immoral, this is grooming behavior. In fact, that's a big part of this podcast. They mock Christians who say that this sexual curriculum is grooming behavior, which it is actually. It fits the legal definition of grooming. So these people, 2.5 years ago, if you had asked me about them, I would have said, listen to the podcast, read their books, read their articles. And now here I am saying the only reason to pay attention to them is to see how corrosive this worldview is inside of parts of the church. So this is not the PCUSA. This is not a Unitarian Universalist church. These are people who are mainstream in the evangelical world. People who are still published by magazines like Christianity Today. So this is a not-so-new phenomenon. The Florida bill is actually not all that different. If you do a little bit of research, you discover the Florida bill is not different from a handful of bills that have been passed over the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years, actually by both Democrats and Republicans, saying don't want sexually grooming curriculum in our elementary schools. So this has been going on for a long time. So what's different now? What's different now is queer theory. What's different now is the woke worldview. That's what's different now. So it's designed to keep a teacher's sexual conversations out of the classroom for elementary-aged kids. It's been falsely labeled the Don't Say Gay bill. And so then what happens, and it's not just these guys, I could list several more, but no one would know their names. But they're authors and they're editors at major Christian magazines and so forth. Christian thought leaders who started complaining about other Christians 2 years ago. So by June of 2020, everybody remembers the summer of 2020. By the June of 2020, these guys are complaining about Christians. They're angry about Christians. They're not angry about riots and beatings and assaults and looting and murders. And they're not bothered by any of that. Trust me, I followed them. I read them. I listened to them. They were not bothered by any of that. They were angry that Christians were upset by it. That's what they were angry at. So they started complaining about other Christians 2 years ago, and they blamed the entire controversy on you and me. So I really do want someone to explain this phenomenon to me, because this is a genuine phenomenon. A cultural movement wants to sexualize children. They want to do so without the consent of their parents. I'm not making this up. This is actually in the stuff that they produce, the lectures that they give, the stuff they write. And they want to encourage hormone therapy in preteen kids. And the people who oppose that, according to these folks, are the ones who are actually doing something wrong. So why are some Christians just completely unable to take a stand on the ethics of human sexuality, but are comfortable assuming that the current cultural view has some kind of validity to it? That is a genuine question. That is a genuine issue. Some of you know, some of you don't. My master's degree is in philosophy of religion. I spent 2.5 years in the philosophy program at CU Boulder. When I told other ministers years ago what I was getting a degree in, I was asked by a handful of other pastors. They don't know what to deal with, a young Assemblies of God minister who's getting a degree in philosophy, so they look at you like you're from Mars. And I actually got the question a couple of times, sometimes half-jokingly. They would just respond with, "Are you still saved?" I spent several years in the universe of Christian academics, and just academics, philosophers in general. This is a real thing. I watched a lot of those, and this is going on 22 years ago now. I was inside of these systems. When I was at CU Boulder, you get to know your tribe. So I discovered 2 other PhD students there at CU Boulder philosophy program who had come out of Biola and Talbot in Southern California. And I've been able to follow one of them in his philosophical career. He's a tenured philosophy professor right now. But he's an example of this phenomenon. I watched 20 years ago Christians at Denver Seminary going through philosophy classes who were constantly, this is Denver Seminary, who were constantly embarrassed by Christians, by the beliefs that Christians held, by the churches that they grew up in, by the things that Christians did and Christians said, but they easily accepted the criticisms of the Christian faith. They easily accepted the secular worldview, and it was always some version of, they really might be onto something. I'm embarrassed by these Christians, but these folks who are antichrists might actually have something interesting to say. So when I type this out, I'm telling you, I've watched it happen. And I've been watching it happen for over 20 years now. I sat next to them in class. This other guy I got to know at CU Boulder for a couple of years, wonderful, wonderful guy. But he's right in line with Phil Vischer and Skye Jitani now. Came out of Biola and Talbot, just the whole thing, the whole package. It is a bizarre phenomenon, but it is a real phenomenon. So being prophetically different from the world is becoming a rare and a valuable commodity. This is one of the reasons why we had Becket Cook on Sunday. Yes, ma'am. Yes, if we don't understand what's happening, we're going to fall for it constantly. And so to be exposed to it, to gather a little bit of natural immunity to this, to know how to fend it off, to recognize it, to deal with it when it shows up is really important. Heather and I have talked about this. This is the reason we had Becket Cook and not somebody else. Because of a lot of other people who have his story or who talk about the kinds of things that he does, I've read and listened to them enough to know I can't trust them. You guys know that I do not give the pulpit up lightly, so I'm only going to do that when I'm pretty sure what's going to happen or what's going to be said. And to be able to trust somebody with this kind of stuff is a really big deal. Now, I can say the things that Becket said on Sunday, but it's Pastor Phil saying these things, right? You can tune me out, it's not that big a deal. But when he says these things, right, that becomes a really significant issue. The one question I asked him, I received an answer I did not expect. I asked him a question about, what was it like to have the support of your brand new church family when your world was changing, your friend structure was changing, all of that was, and your friends were falling away, but you've got this new church, family coming alongside you. And I've known in his story, he had people who helped pay his way through seminary and encouraged him and prayed with him constantly. So that's what I was expecting, because a pastor asks questions like that so that you guys hear him say that. Church is this important. It's this valuable. But then you remember what he said next. He said, it's trailed off. I don't have as much support as I used to have, and I long for those days when I had that much support. Why does that happen? This is how that happens. This is why that happens. Some sort of individual who is prophetically different from the culture, who's speaking truth in love and grace. There's so much pressure upon the Christian and the pastor of the church to change biblical teaching. A lot of people are just changing. They're sometimes changing in subtle and weird ways. I said this the other night. Poor Heather has to hear me gripe these things constantly. But I've been saying this now for a while now. 2020 was just too much for some people. They were not grounded enough. They were not stable enough. They were not smart enough. They were not wise enough. They did not have what it takes to watch the events of 2020 and deal with them biblically. They just didn't have it. And here we are, watching this kind of stuff, okay? So every now and then you're going to hear me say that. Now you know what I mean. It was just too much for some people. They didn't know what to do, so they just slipped right along with the rest of the culture. The very last paragraph of that article that I had for you says this. Back in 2019, Vischer was far more unequivocal about the dissemination of LGBT subjects to children when he declared that he would refuse, quote, pressure from Hollywood to show two men getting married because we've all decided it's right and correct because, quote, that's not what I believe is best for kids. You know, and he produces cartoons and movies and he deals with these people constantly. So what's so special about that paragraph? It was 2019. So what happened between 2019 and 2021? 2020. It was just too much for some people. It's just too much. So here we go. And now we've got this bizarre phenomenon inside of the evangelical community. I could go on, and I won't, because then I'm just going to sound like I'm being grumpy and vicious. I'm not going to do that. But it is, some of this stuff is literally R and X rated. And there's some things that I could show you, and they're cartoons designed for kindergartners, literally about how to watch pornography. And they're cartoons, and I just happened to see one of the videos pop up, and I thought, this is crazy. And then it was X-rated. And they're showing this, and the reason we know this now is that a whistleblower inside of a school system, it was either in New Jersey or Illinois, just started posting all the curriculum that they have inside of their elementary schools. And it's just, and why on earth some of these people can't begin this conversation by saying, that's moral evil. I'm not all that bothered by Christians thinking I'm going to homeschool my kids now. What I'm really bothered by is this moral evil, right? So now you've got something to say to your friends and family later on. 2020 was just too much for some people. Mother, yes. Sorry, I've got to. I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's just going to get more and more complicated, and it's going to grow harder to have this lifestyle inside of this world and inside of this culture. To be different from the world for the sake of the world, to preach a gospel to a world that is in darkness. It's something that needs to be done, but you can't preach that gospel if you've stepped into the darkness and said, this is actually kind of interesting. You have to stand in the light. You have to say, this is moral evil. God loves your soul, and here's how you get transferred from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. You can't tell that story from inside of the kingdom of darkness. I just really don't think you can. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I love that part of the story, and I asked that question on purpose. I loved getting that phrase out of him where he just landed and he said, if they had, waffled, or if they had said we were an accepting church, an affirming church, he said, I would have known they were frauds. And at the time, he was an atheist man living a homosexual lifestyle. I would have known they were frauds. Yeah, you just go about your business and